Yeah, thanks for coming. So yeah, as Julia mentioned, this is definitely, I'm looking for a very informal, conversational tone here because we got a little bit of time. We got plenty of time to talk about this stuff, and we're going to go all the way from the 10,000 feet down to lines of code. So if you have questions along the way, please speak up. I'll make sure and repeat it for the video and other people to hear, and we'll keep going. So, all right, let's get started. So my name is Kevin Killingsworth. As Julie said, I'm pretty much Coder Kevin everywhere. This includes GitHub, Twitter, all the places. So, if you want to see what I'm up to on GitHub, feel free to follow me on there. Pretty much all of my work is on GitHub, open source on the Automatic or WooCommerce organization repos, and then same on Twitter. So when we set out to make WooCommerce scalable, we did a lot of talking around this. We said, okay, so we all know that WooCommerce has some scaling issues because the way that it was developed was, WordPress plugin. We did things the WordPress plugin way. That means post-meta, a lot of post-meta, and eventually, that's probably the single thing that really catches up to you over time. And so we talked about, okay, how can we make this scalable and still support all of our extensions? How can we, do what needs to be done and make this available, for a higher scaling, even up to like enterprise level? What are the things that we need to tackle here? So obviously, if you look at e-commerce or really any large sites out there, you've got a wide range, even like WordPress, right? We've got all the way from, some of the, cheaper hosting solutions, for people, hey, I've got a blog and I want to put that up, all the way up to, some of the big, like VIP partners, Time and CBS and New York Times, and, a lot of very large scale companies, right? And so we were looking on how to do that with WooCommerce as well. So, step one, has anybody heard about CRUD objects in WooCommerce? Yeah? Okay. So CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. This actually kind of comes from like database terminology. If you know much about SQL databases, you know about select and insert and update and delete. Same thing here, right? But it doesn't apply just to relational databases. This applies to NoSQL databases and queues, and pretty much anything you have to be able to create new things, you have to be able to update them, you have to be able to delete them, and you have to read them the way that you need. And so this is where we really focused our attention is what are the business objects of WooCommerce? We've got products, we've got orders, we've got customers, we've got coupons, things like that. Product categories, even stuff like that, right? And so we really looked at, okay, so what can we do here to make an interface around this? And that's exactly what we did. Some of you may have remembered the blog post from a while ago. I'll show this to you real quick. Does anybody remember this one? Yeah. So this is where it kind of started, like the big public conversation. And granted, we were talking about this stuff ahead of time, of course, internally, and we were thinking about how can we best support our customers and our extensions and our environment. And if you haven't read this blog post, I really recommend you take a look at it on the dev blog. But anyways, along with the CRUD objects, and so this is one of the things that I helped out. At the time I was on the core team, and we talked about, okay, CRUD, how are we going to implement this? And I can take credit for the idea of data stores, but none of the implementation. Actually, the rest of the core team is really awesome in getting this stuff done. So the data stores are how we interface with our persistent storage, right? And so there are a couple things that really help out with the concept of a data store. You can think of CRUD objects as they're just in memory. That's all they are. I am a product, and I have these fields, and that's it, right? That's all I do. I don't know how I'm stored on a database or anywhere else, and I don't really care. All I know is I have these fields that I care about and any business logic around that internal to that. And then the data stores really pick up the slack on how that data is stored in a database, right? And so the base data store interface has actually like the CRUD operations. It has, read and update and create and that sort of stuff. Also, your data store can query all of the things that it has, and it can hand them over to you. But what happens is it hands over an array of CRUD objects, and those CRUD objects have a reference back to from whence they came, that data store, right? And this is where things get pretty interesting, because you have this concept of data flexibility. They don't have to come just from a database. They could come from a cluster of databases. They could come from a combination of databases, right? Maybe one object is actually a result of two queries, potentially. Maybe it's not even a relational database at all. Maybe it's a NoSQL database. Maybe it's a Redis queue or something like that. A lot of these things are possible now because of these data stores. One thing, just an aside real quick, on as far as extensions go, if those of you who are extension developers, you've probably been following this pretty closely already. And if you've been following the dev blog, you already know there's something we're asking of all the extension developers. We have to stop using post-meta directly in order to benefit from this stuff. We have to all start moving our code over to using these CRUD objects to get these benefits. But the benefits are pretty big. So this is the way things work right now by default. So we have some code. You can think of the little man over on the left as maybe the application code, right? This could be your WP admin page, right? It could be your hook that you're hooking into for that page. It could be a WP REST API call, right, into the WooCommerce API. But basically you're saying, hey, can I get orders, right? And our default data store right now still does exactly what it's always done before. It does get post-meta, right? It goes and gets all of the data from your post-meta, and it hands it right back to you in an array of order objects, right? And so nothing new is here, but that's sort of the beauty of it, right? Because we can actually implement this abstraction and not break anything, at least right now. So I'm guessing some of you have probably already thought of this part. If we were reading a lot of post-meta, what's the thing that we can do to increase performance, right? And a lot of us have come to the same conclusion. Well, the first step is custom tables, right? And so, for instance, I think on orders, well, depending on what extensions you have installed, you can have up to 50 post-meta rows per order, right? 60, even better, overachiever here. So, I mean, let's be a little conservative and say 50. So 50 post-meta rows per order. Let's extrapolate that out. How many database rows is that for, we'll say 100,000 orders, right? I mean, is 100,000 orders unreasonable to expect for a successful e-commerce site? No, I think that's fairly reasonable, right? But now you've got 5 million rows in your database. And that's just for the orders. That's not counting all the rest of the post-meta that everything else is thrown in there, right? So this gets pretty unwieldy pretty quick, right? So what's the solution? Oh, well, maybe we can make a custom table, and that's a really reasonable solution. In fact, that's something that we're looking at as potentially sort of the next default data store. As soon as we can get all of our extensions moved over and all of that, right? We have that option, then we can make this the default, right? And so by doing this, I've talked to some people. You guys will get to see some of this example code here. The MindSize guys and the Liquid Web, and it's pretty awesome. These guys actually beat us to it in making a custom table extension with data stores, which is pretty great. And which is always our intention. We were always looking at those orders, right? It's pretty amazing, the performance increase. I mean, it's over an order of magnitude faster for some of these. So I mean, over 10 times faster on some of these things. Yeah. One thing, as far as custom tables go, so do custom tables solve all of our problems, right? Well, I guess it depends. I mean, if you have a medium-sized, mid-sized site and you're dealing with maybe hundreds of thousands of orders and that's all you have, maybe so. What happens if you have millions of orders, right? Well, I mean, say you have 5 million orders. That's 5 million rows in a custom table. Now you're kind of back where you started, right? And still 5 million rows in a table. You know where queries go with that, right? So, the important part is we're putting in these abstractions, and the abstractions are permanent, right? And this is what we all build on. And the best part about these abstractions are, by the time that you need to implement something, hopefully, if you're doing things right, you've already acquired a lot of revenue that you can work with, right? You know, if you're getting hundreds of thousands of orders, chances are you've got a little bit of money to spend on working on your infrastructure, right? And so these become solvable problems, right? And you can throw some more servers at them, you can throw some different database configurations and stuff like that, and having these abstractions in place make that possible for configurations that even go above and beyond a custom table. So we've got here a little diagram. It's very much like the old one. But here's a custom table data store, and you can see there's only one thing that changed in here. Now we're doing a get row call in there instead of get post meta, right? And that get row can get us many, many columns of information, right? So, we have any questions so far? We kind of sped through this part. Questions? Yes, sir.
I have a really specific one. In your crud object, you have a save method, which kind of wraps it up, wraps all the changes and saves them. And there is a method that I don't exactly remember the name, but it's like kind of update, which merges the changes with existing data.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't save them. What is the purpose of it? Like, why it exists, and what is the idea behind it?
Okay, so the question was, we've got the save method, and we've also got an update method. So on some of these CRUD objects, and keep in mind these CRUD object methods, like save and stuff, they're actually just calling down into whatever data store they're pointed at, right? That's the actual work that's being done on these. And so because these things are just memory objects, sometimes you want to do repeated in-memory adjustments to these objects, right? Maybe this part of the code, might set some different fields, and then it moves on, and now this part of the code sets some other stuff, right? And then you can do one operation down to the database. Yeah, so that's why we have like the getters and the setters and all of that stuff on there as well, right? Because you can actually go through and modify these CRUD objects however you see fit, and it's all in memory at that point. And it's not until you actually save it down through the data store that it actually gets persisted at that point. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. The idea is like if you need to see how the data looks after the changes, you call update method, and then you can like make other calls or set different parameters with this existing data, and after that you save it, right?
Yeah. Although I guess it depends on. You may want to call individual like set methods on there as well. It depends on what you want to do.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
all right. Question back there?
Yeah, just with regards custom tables.
Mm-hmm.
Am I right in saying that your milestone for that is version 4.0? Is that correct, or am I just making that up? Or maybe I should ask the question another way. Is this like really a priority for you guys? Are you really pushing this forward? And is there like an ETA?
Right. So the question was about custom tables and if we're looking at moving over to a default implementation of that. And I'm not sure that we've announced anything around that, but what I can say is, we're trying to include the community conversations and stuff, right? I mean, it seems like a pretty logical progression that this may be a good choice for us to move forward to in the future. What I can say is the CRUD objects in the data store are really the cornerstone of WooCommerce scalability moving forward. I can tell you, about my personal feelings about why I feel the CRUD objects in the data stores are so important. I mean, let's be realistic. Most people who set up a WooCommerce store are not going to make millions doing it, right? I mean, let's be realistic. However, everybody who wants to sell something online, they have those stars in their eyes and they know, oh, this is going to be the next big thing. It's going to be awesome. And who knows, it may be, right? But the fact of the matter is they're making decisions on what horse they're going to ride, right? They're going to make those decisions on, oh, which e-commerce platform should I choose? Well, I know this thing's going to make it big, so it has to be able to scale. It has to be big, right? And so even if that store owner never ever reaches a point where they need to scale up in these data stores, they're still making decisions based on that, right? And the more that we have the ability to scale up, the more customers and the more store owners we're going to get at all levels there. And so this is why I feel like it's extremely important. And so if you have extensions, I know that we've mentioned it before, but please, talk to us if you don't understand, if you need some help. But we need to get those converted over to the CRUD objects so we can all move forward and scale up really big on this stuff. So, any other questions before we move on? All right. So, here's where things get a little bit crazy. So we've talked about scalability and performance, right? And we all know, okay, maybe custom tables are the best first step for that. You can get a little bit further there. But I always, in my experience, when you have a good abstraction, like the data stores and like the CRUD objects, and you have sort of some happy unintended benefits, I guess that's when I feel like, oh wow, maybe this is a really good thing, right? And so I'm going to go through some of the unintended benefits that have sort of cropped up and become possible. And so this is beyond just scalability and performance. It's like thinking, well, what can we do with this sort of abstraction? So one of these, multiple sites, multiple databases, right? So what if you had a single place that you were shipping from, right? But maybe you have, you're selling in the US, but you're also selling in the UK, and maybe you're also selling in Brazil, and maybe also Australia. Do you really want to serve all of those from a single site in the US, right? UK, it's probably okay. I mean, the link is pretty good. Let's talk about Australia, though, right? I mean, we all know the link between the US and Australia is super slow, and it's pretty onerous, right? Do you really want to load all of your product images and all of that sort of stuff from there? Probably not. It'd be much better if you could stand up a site in Australia, in Brazil. Not only that, but actually there are some countries that require that you actually serve your site in their country, right? There's some legal concerns there as well. But you still have the same inventory in the same warehouse in the US, and you ship all over the world, right? What do you do about that? You've got multiple sites, multiple currencies, right? But the same inventory. What if you could have a data store that would get its inventory information not from the normal post meta or not from the custom table implementation that maybe you have, but what if it actually could go to an inventory system and get that information and then send that back no matter what site you're on, right? So I've got a little bit of a diagram here kind of showing some of that. So here we've got two different sites, and they look very similar. I mean, this is stuff that everybody, if you've worked with WooCommerce, you're pretty familiar with this. So you've got your orders data store, and it has your orders, and it stores those in the WordPress database. You've also got products. Same thing, right? Nothing new here. But what if you've got your inventory in a separate database? So what if you customize your products data store and you get most of your information from the WordPress database, but you get your inventory count from another database, right? That's totally possible, right? And actually, I've got some code example that shows just that. It doesn't even have to be necessarily just a database that you're going straight to. It could actually be like another server, right? You could have an inventory server, or there are inventory control systems out there, tons of them, right? And then people are already using them. What if you have a new client and they already have an inventory control system? Maybe they work with a drop shipping company, or they work, they've already got that part figured out, right? Why make them re-implement everything in WordPress, right? Why not just tie into what they've already got? Any questions on that? Is it making sense to everybody? Yeah? Good deal.
How exactly?
I'm sorry?
How exactly should we do that?
I have a code example to show you. Yeah, the question was,
Can't wait.
the question was how do we do that? And I definitely have a code example for you. It is the last one though, so I'm going to make you wait. All right, so another really cool thing that we get with data stores. So what happens if I have my default data store? And I say, okay, give me all the products, right? And so now I have this array of products. What happens if I iterate that array, and on each array, I set the data store to another data store, right? Then I go through all those products and I say save. What have I just done, right? I've exported from one data store and imported it into another data store. I mean, basically for free, right? Because all your data stores do, they read and write to persistence, right? And so when you do come up with, oh, we've got a custom table implementation, right? How do we migrate the data from post-meta to here, right? Well, I mean, you could just use the default data store to read all of your stuff in from post-meta, and then you change the data store on them and save them out to your custom table, right? I mean, it doesn't even have to be, again, custom tables. I've actually kicked around the idea of making a CSV data store. Not for production or anything, right? But I just thought it'd be cool. Why not just pull it in and then like save it out to CSV in like a WP CLI command? That'd be pretty cool, right? Or XML or an API or all of this stuff, right? I don't know about you all, but that gets me pretty excited to think about. Yeah. So here's a little diagram of how that might work. So just like we talked about, you've got your post-meta data store up at the top. You read all your orders in, and then you iterate through them, and you save them down to the next one, right? Looks pretty simple, almost too simple. So, any questions on that? Or comments? Points of exclamation or excitement?
I guess theoretically that's easy, but like the processing time, to grab from one spot, go out to save it to another spot, like on the fly, might not be ideal. So would there be, I guess, maybe WooCommerce moving to custom tables? Would there be just a push, like a button basically you would press just to start that whole process? Maybe just at once. Maybe.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you could do it just like we do database upgrades and stuff today, right? I mean, you could do it through a batch process of some kind, that sort of thing. Or actually, as you'll see in the first code example, the MindSize guys, they have a mechanism to just do them kind of piecemeal, one at a time, as they get used. So, I mean, you've got options here. Yeah, and actually, that's a really good point. So as you were talking about the how do you scale, and how do you convert things over in a scalable way? That's a very important thing to think about, especially when you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of records or more, right? That's when you start to have issues, and it's always a trade-off, right? Do we take the hit? Do we convert stuff over a weekend or whatever? I mean, I've migrated large databases and that sort of stuff, and it's been really tricky. I mean, what we ended up doing is just saving off tons of exported data, and then at the same time we put in database triggers to catch anything new, right? And we'd save those off to other tables. And so then we do the big one and convert that over, and then we'd pick up the other ones that that happened in that amount of time, right? Yeah. And so these things become very application specific and client specific, right? And it depends on the nature of their business, right? Is this something you can do in a weekend, or do you need to do a piecemeal, or can they hold things in post meta at the same time as the other, right? Do they have that much storage, right? So yeah, these are all things to consider, but the best part about it is we're having this conversation to begin with, right? Which means that it's possible to begin with, and now we can say, okay, how do we want to do it, not can we do it, right? Yes, sir.
Regarding subscriptions and membership
Mm-hmm.
extensions right now, are those also, have they been upgraded to be able to take advantage of this?
Okay, so the question was subscriptions and memberships. I definitely don't want to speak for SkyVerge or Prospress on this, and I actually haven't followed up with them on the progress, but I'm sure that they are, if it's not done, they are working on it. I can't imagine that, I'm sure that they are very aware of the situation and working towards that, yeah. So, that said, those are the biggest plugins, right? Those are the biggest extensions, right? So it's not an easy thing. I'm sure that there's a lot of code that has to be looked at for there. Just like, we've been going through all of our extensions, at Automatic. We've been going through all the extensions that we've got to switch them over. So, and actually even just doing core, that was a huge amount of work. And actually even on that, we still have a little bit of work to do in the reporting area. Yeah. So, good question. But yeah, I think we'll have to, I know SkyVerge and Prospress folks are here, so I'm sure they would be happy to talk to you about it. Any other questions? All right. I think we don't have very many slides, so we're going to be digging into code here. Yep. Called it. So if you want to get started with this stuff, these are the steps, right? So it's actually pretty easy to do from within a plugin. We've got hooks for it. There are a couple prerequisites that you have to, it's really just the hooks. Whatever data operations you need, whatever you're doing there, and then address data migration. And again, this becomes very application specific, right? And if you're designing a plugin, you may have just like a base way of doing that. But if you're like we talked about, if you're doing hundreds of thousands, or if your solution could be used for that scale, I think you really need to think about that when you implement this and make sure that you're going to scale at it, or make sure that what you're doing could be modified to scale at that, right? So, and that's it for the slides. So, from here on, we're going to be digging around on some code. I've set up a little local Docker image here. So, we got some products to work with here. Got a single order to work with, just so we got some data to play with. And I've got a few plugins here, 3 of them actually. So this one, WooCommerce Custom Order Table, this is actually some code from MindSize and Liquid Web. They've been working on this stuff. And this is like what I said. When we implemented the data stores, we'd always intended on upgrading the order table as our first order of business. But yeah, they've already jumped on it, so that's great. We definitely pointed them in the right direction, but they really did most of it. And I think you'll be surprised at actually how little. It's not a ton of code, at least for orders. The next one is actually this one here. This is super cool, actually. The WooCommerce core team, they've actually been here in Seattle for a few days, working together in a little meetup, and this is something they've been working on just on the last few days. This is in a private repo right now, but they told me that they will be opening it up in a couple days, as soon as they've got it finished. For example stuff. The product stuff gets a little bit more complex, right? Because you got variations, you got categories, you got all this other stuff, right? And so This one, they're not done with it yet, but we can definitely take a look at the code and see what they've got. This one here is the one that I just wrote. This one's super, super small. It is just demo code. It is not completely functional. It takes nothing into consideration for variations, for example, or anything else. But I think you'll like it. So let's start at the custom order table from the MindSize guys here. So let's see. I'm going to expand this out a little bit here. So here I've just got the plugins directory. It's order tables 1. All right, and we'll pop up and look at some of this code here. All right. Can everybody see that? Is it big enough? Okay. So, yeah, this is the entry point. I mean, honestly, not a ton to see here. You can see it's got a table install sort of feature. Yeah, and then this stuff here, the setup and all. So yeah, not a whole lot to look here, but let's go in here and let's take a look at the table install. I mean, this is this is just set up here. It's creating a table. There you go. And this is where a little bit more of the meat is here. So you can see from here, data store custom table extends abstract WC data store. So this is sort of an abstract class that you can do. But the important part here is these interfaces. The WC object data store interface, that has your base functions of reading and updating and that sort of stuff. And then the order stuff has order-specific stuff, right? So some order-specific functionality there. That's all you have to do to make your data stores, just implement those interfaces. They've got a post-meta mapping here. So they're mapping that to their custom table stuff. And here are those main functions: create, delete, read, right? This plugin also has an extra bit of functionality. It actually goes and backports. It like updates the post meta as well at the same time. This is a little bit of a fail-safe because not all extensions are ported over, right? This actually populates the post meta as well, so that way it keeps from breaking a bunch of stuff. Kind of built in here. Mm-hmm. The question was, is there a performance impact for doing both of those operations? I'm sure there is. I mean, at the end of the day, you're pushing bits both places, right? But yeah, actually, if you'd like to.
No, I was wondering about arbitrary metadata.
Uh-huh.
For example, I have my usual order, I have my usual metadata.
Mm-hmm.
But what is other metadata which I want to store as well? Is there already a solution in this? I mean, because I saw the data table contains basically all the data.
Mm-hmm.
There's something like where I can say arbitrary meta with this.
Right. Right. There are meta operations on the CRUD, on the data store implementations that you can save that sort of thing. Although, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, you could still keep some of that extra stuff in post-meta. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if you have 60 post-meta fields and you put 50 of them into a custom table and you leave 10, you're still a lot better off, right? And so, If you have them in some kind of meta table, that's fine. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there is a performance implication for this, but when you need backward compatibility with existing extensions, and it can still, there's a performance implication when you save data because you're saving it in both places, right? But still, for like the core queries and stuff, if you're querying from that, from your custom table, that's still going to be a lot faster, right? Yeah. Now, I mean, granted, if you've got some of the other extensions that aren't aware of the CRUD objects and they're not using those and they're still doing post-meta queries, well, I mean, there's going to be no speed up there. So, yeah. Zach in the back, is there something you'd like to add?
So the primary reason that method exists is so that there's a way back. So we don't want you to start using this and have no way to work your data back over.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a CLI command to go to custom order names. We also have a command to go back to posts and post content. So that's the primary reason that method's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important. So Zach, one of the guys who is responsible for creating this early code here, it's pretty exciting. Especially in these early days of making these, it's definitely, you want to consider how you can make sure that you can go back if you need to. It's a safe bet, because you're playing with people's data, right? You want to make sure that you're not losing it or corrupting it in some way. Yeah. All right. Any other questions or comments about this? Okay. All right. So, I mean, the rest of the stuff is, it just really has to do with how do you deal with data in a custom table, right? Which is really nice. This is another real advantage of having things in a separate data store class rather than intermingling this code with the CRUD object business logic, right? You don't have to trip over, the validation and, the other things about, the objects that they care about. You can really just focus your code on what do I need to do to read and save data, right? So here we're getting into some more specific things for orders, right? So this is part of that second interface. And here you've got total flexibility to do whatever you need to do with your database. Now, here, again, the cool thing is this is a WPDB call that's prepared statement and stuff, but there's no reason that this couldn't also be going to a NoSQL database, right? I mean, it could be going to whatever you want or whatever you need. Another thing to keep in mind is, this gives us the flexibility. Say you sign up with a new client, and they already have a database with all of this stuff in it, right? Now you can look at, okay, what's their database schema? What data do they have? How does that line up with what WooCommerce needs in these interfaces? And if you can fulfill these interfaces with their data, then you can just use the data as the way it is. And so you don't have to synchronize between their database and our database and all of that stuff. You can just use their data straight up and not break the rest of their system doing it. Yep. So, more of this stuff. Is there anything that anybody would like to see in specific, about this implementation, or should I enable the plugin and show what happens?
Enable.
All right, we'll do it. So, back over here, I wanted to show, so I have a little database program here. Let's see. All right, so I know this is a little bit tiny here. I tried expanding it, and I found that I can't really. But if you are familiar with what a database looks like with WooCommerce installed, you've probably seen these tables. All of the familiar ones and all the normal WordPress ones here, right? So let's give this guy a try here. So just activated the plugin there. Let's take a look over here. Let's see. And let's go ahead and go to the orders. Oh no. Let's see, let's try this again. Well, folks, it looks like I'm falling victim to the demo mentality. Yeah, the problems. I actually did run this code last night, and yeah, it worked flawlessly. So, but I did have to do a hard reboot of this computer right before we started here. So that may have something to do with it. But yeah, I can personally vouch for this. That it does create the table on startup if it hasn't been created already. And then, yeah, it'll actually save it off. And so this is that plugin that this one will actually save off as you go, right? So as you access that order, it will actually read it and save it off as you edit them, right? And so because this one kind of straddles between the post meta and the custom table, it can actually pull data from both, right? And so that's the cool thing is it can pull it and then just save them off to the custom table as you go. Mm-hmm.
I'm just considering right now, I think it's a good, I guess, workaround, for the time being. But I mean, in the future, especially my company, we work with publishing and e-commerce at the same time on the same site, and the post-meta table. I mean, eventually you want to clear that off, right?
Certainly. Right.
I know I've run into it already with our developers. It's like trying to delete data from a huge table. Sometimes it just fails. Like I've been trying to figure out how do we start to remove old data so that your queries, for other processes for your business are running a lot more efficient.
That's a tricky one. So the question was, when you have so much data in your post meta and you really want to migrate over to something like a custom table or something else, you really want to get rid of that data from your post meta, which, yeah, I completely agree. That's a tough one because, I mean, how's it affecting your query performance? Are you still querying okay on it? Do you have good indexes? And
Right now, it's working. Yeah, it's working as it can. And I mean, the
okay.
site's performing not should, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
Standard-wise, it's okay.
Yeah.
But we would definitely rather have it perform,
Right.
excellent. So that's a challenge, I guess, we're trying to figure out.
If it were me, I mean, if you were having timeouts and stuff on individual delete calls, I would probably leave them in there until you've converted over, because they're not hurting you that much. And then after you've converted over and you're solid on that, and you feel like you're in a good place there, make sure and make good backups. But then I'd have a batch process, just go and delete them all out, and have a script, or something like that to go and delete those out. I think you'd probably have a little bit more luck with that. Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, again, these are probably going to be very application specific, and depending on how much volume you've got on this, you may have to clone the database and then delete it here, and then swap them out. And if you can't bring the system down, maybe you have to have those triggers that collect the new data in another table, and then you can sync those up. Yeah. So it can get messy. Yeah. One other thing I wanted to show you on this. You remember how I talked about you get import and export for free? So in their CLI tool here, this is pretty cool here. So in this migrate stuff, maybe it's in the backfill. Let's see. Zach, if you can help me, where's that part where you save it off again, using the new data store? Is it here? Right. But this, this CLI command actually does what we talked about. It actually goes through and it pulls from one data store, reassigns the data store for the CRUD object, and then saves it off to the other one as part of the migrate process on the CLI tool. Yeah. Yep. I've got one. I'm going to skip ahead to the other one and show you real quick. So product inventory data store. So this one, here's a data store, and it just implements. Notice it doesn't inherit from anything. What it does is it takes the parent data store as an instance, and check this out. It implements all of these just by calling functions here, right? And I've only made one change here. So check this out. When I read a product, look, I can just hard code 20 right in there. Or more interestingly, look at this. So here, I've got a URL. It's another site, and I'm actually doing a WP remote get and retrieving that and decoding it and setting the stock quantity before I move on. So this actually just uses whatever data store is in there already, but this is that part that manages the inventory somewhere else, which is pretty exciting. So this is actually just a little node server. And if I go over here, I can do that, and it just gives me the number, right? If I activate this with that code, let's see, do I have that code? I think I need to save this. So I save this, and now if I read from this, look at that. That number right there came from a node server, but just that number. The rest of it is all from the WordPress database. So, yay, a demo worked. All right, well, I think that's it. We're actually just a little bit over time. Sorry about that. But yeah, if you have more questions, feel free to come up and talk to me. After we're here, you can hit me up on Twitter or whatever. I'll be happy to talk about this stuff. So, thank you much for your time.